This story recounts one of the most documented hauntings in modern history. It contains descriptions of alleged paranormal events that some listeners may find unsettling. Please use discretion if you're listening before sleep. There are houses that look ordinary by day, their bricks warm in the sunlight, their curtains fluttering softly. But at night, some houses breathe differently. Some houses remember, and some houses wait. Tonight, I'll take you to one of those places, a modest red brick council house in North London, where, behind faded wallpaper and creaking floorboards, something unseen stirred. This is no invented legend, but a story drawn from real reports, one that begins softly, like a whisper through the walls, and grows into a force no one could explain. If dark, true tales like this one help you drift into that strange twilight between wakefulness and dreams, you can gently tap subscribe now. More stories like these will come to find you in the night. Now close your eyes and picture it. A red brick council house at the end of a quiet street, ivy crawling across its face, its windows glowing faintly against the London dusk. This is where our story begins. In the quiet sprawl of North London, nestled between the rising hum of urban life and the lingering shadows of an older, more industrial age, there stood a house, a modest, weathered red brick council house, softened by the embrace of creeping ivy. It had been built in the early part of the century, the kind of house that absorbed the passage of time, the kind whose walls seemed to hold the memories of those who had walked through its rooms. Inside, there was an old musty smell, the scent of dampness seeping from the very bones of the house. The floorboards creaked with a peculiar rhythm, as if each step taken within it stirred some forgotten thing, deep within its foundation. The world beyond this house bustled with the sounds of busy streets, children's laughter, and the occasional rumble of passing trains. But within the house itself, there was a stillness, a quiet that seemed to stretch on forever, a silence so complete it almost hummed, as though the very air was waiting for something. There were moments, in the deepest hours of the night, when the faintest of sounds echoed through the walls, a tapping, almost like a distant knock, a sound so faint, so subtle, it could easily be dismissed. That was, until it grew louder. Inside this home lived the Hodgson family, a mother, Peggy, who was a quiet, hard-working woman, and her 4 children, Margaret, Johnny, Billy, and Janet. Janet, just 12 years old at the time, was the youngest of the children. She was an ordinary girl. Her days filled with simple joys, playing with friends, the mundane happiness of childhood, her toys scattered across the floor, a tangle of stories she told to herself, woven into her imagination. She had not yet felt the world grow heavy with dread, but the days to come would change that forever. The first sign of the house's dark secrets did not come as a thunderclap, but as a whisper, a soft sound, faint and unremarkable, yet enough to stir the air. It began late one evening as the family settled into their nightly routines. The walls groaned, as they often did in houses that had seen many winters. But this was different. The sound was sharper, more insistent, a soft, scraping noise, almost like the rustling of something small within the walls. It would come and go, fleeting but undeniable. Janet had been the first to notice it. She had been lying in her bed, half asleep, the soft hum of the world outside her window still echoing in her ears when she heard it. At first, she had told herself it was nothing, just the house settling, perhaps, or the wind whistling through the gaps in the windows. But the sound came again, and again, a slow tapping, then a sharp scrape, as though something was trying to claw its way out from behind the walls. She had lain there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the strange noise. Every time it paused, she held her breath, waiting for it to resume. But it never did. It was only when her eyelids fluttered shut, the exhaustion of the day catching up with her, that the sound stopped altogether. The next day, the sound was forgotten, like a half-remembered dream. Janet went on about her day as she always did. The air seemed warmer in the house, the light streaming through the small windows lending everything an almost serene glow. Yet, As the evening drew closer and the shadows began to creep deeper into the rooms, the house, once again, seemed to become heavier. That night, as the family gathered around for a quiet dinner, the strange noises returned. They were not the soft, faint taps of the previous night. No, this time it was louder, more deliberate. A scratching, a scraping, as though something, or someone, was moving through the walls. The children's eyes met one another in startled confusion. Even Peggy, the mother who had always dismissed such things, frowned, her brow furrowed in unease. "Is that the wind?" she asked, her voice tight with a forced calm. Janet shook her head, her eyes wide and unsure. She didn't want to be the one to bring up what had happened the night before. It was only a sound, after all. A strange, unexplained sound that could have been anything. The others might not even notice it, so why should she mention it? But then, just as she was about to turn her focus back to her food, there came a louder, more insistent bang from the wall, a sharp, sudden noise that rattled the very foundation of the house. It seemed to come from behind the fireplace, deep in the heart of the house. For a moment, the room fell into an unnatural stillness. No one spoke. Janet's fingers gripped her spoon with a tightness that felt foreign, her stomach suddenly tight. Margaret, the older sister, exchanged a glance with her mother but said nothing. It was as if they all, collectively agreed that some things were better left unsaid. The night fell, heavier than usual, and yet, as the house hummed with its usual creaks and sighs, it was clear that something had shifted within it. Something was changing. The family did not know it yet, but the events of that night would mark the beginning of a terror that would last for years. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the house itself seemed to settle deeper into its bones, as though it were preparing for something long anticipated. It was the next day that the first object moved. It was a simple thing, a toy, Janet's beloved doll, which she had left on the floor the night before. When she returned to her room in the morning, she found it across the room, facing her bed. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light. Maybe she had moved it the night before and forgotten. But then the realization came with an unsettling clarity. She hadn't touched it. Her heart raced. The hairs on the back of her neck rose. She knelt beside the doll, her fingers brushing against its cold, smooth plastic skin. The air in the room felt different, heavier. She turned it over in her hands, inspecting the faded clothes, the cracked porcelain. There was no explanation for how it had moved, none that made sense at least. "Janet," her mother called from the doorway. "You all right in there?" Janet turned quickly, startled by the sound of her mother's voice. She stood there, holding the doll in trembling hands, unsure how to explain it. But she didn't have to. Her mother's eyes had already landed on the toy, and in that moment, Janet knew that whatever was happening in the house, it was no longer just her imagination. Peggy's gaze flickered to the walls, then to the door, before she spoke in a voice quieter than usual. "I think it's time we talked to someone." The room felt colder then. The house seemed to breathe, as if it were aware that something was being acknowledged, something that had been waiting in the dark. Outside, the faint tapping continued. The night that followed was a restless one. The house brimming with an unease that seemed to thicken the air. Janet lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts tangled in the strange happenings that had begun to creep through the walls like an unwelcome presence. The doll, still sitting on her dresser, felt like an unspoken symbol of something deeper, something darker that had begun to emerge. The tapping continued, a sound that now seemed too deliberate to be anything other than a warning. Peggy had not slept well either. In the early morning hours, she had wandered into the kitchen, the dim light from the street lamp outside casting long shadows across the room. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. She sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of cold tea, staring into the quiet darkness. Every creak, every groan of the house made her jump, her nerves frayed by the thought of what was happening. or what might be happening. The tapping had stopped for a while, only to return with an eerie persistence. It was as though the house were trying to tell them something, to get their attention. But whatever it was, it seemed trapped just beneath the surface of normality. Peggy wanted to dismiss it, to convince herself that it was nothing more than the house settling, the noises that came with age and the changing seasons. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the cold knot of fear that twisted in her stomach. Janet, too, had not yet found sleep. Her thoughts were tangled in a web of questions, a swirling mass of confusion and dread. Was it really happening? Was it possible that something unseen, was causing the strange events? And if so, what did it want? She closed her eyes, trying to shake the unease, but the questions clung to her like a second skin. It was then that she heard it, the faintest of whispers, barely audible at first, a voice, low and guttural, coming from somewhere just beyond her reach. It was as though it were speaking from the walls themselves, its words indistinct, twisted in a way that made them impossible to decipher. Janet froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She strained her ears, trying to make out the sound, but it was gone as quickly as it had come, leaving only the silence and the cold breath of the night. She wanted to call out, to wake her mother, but the fear lodged itself in her throat. She had no words to describe what was happening, no way to make sense of the impossible. So she lay there, staring into the darkness, feeling the weight of the silence settle in around her once more. By the time morning came, the world outside the house seemed to be as ordinary as ever. The sun rose, casting its pale light through the windows, and the sounds of the neighborhood filtered in. The distant chatter of voices, the hum of passing cars. But inside the house, nothing felt the same. The atmosphere had shifted. It was as though the house had become aware of the attention it had garnered and was now waiting for something. The walls, once familiar and comforting, now seemed to pulse with an unknown energy. The day passed slowly, each hour dragging with the heaviness of something unsaid, something watching from just out of sight. Peggy went about her usual routine, though the smile she wore felt more like a mask than a genuine expression. She went through the motions of caring for the children, but there was a nervousness to her movements, a tautness in the way she spoke. "Everything all right, love?" Margaret asked as they sat down for lunch, her voice tinged with concern. "You don't seem yourself." Peggy smiled, but it was a brittle thing, and it didn't reach her eyes. "Just tired, dear. Long night," she said, but her words lacked conviction. Margaret didn't press. She had learned over the years that sometimes it was better not to ask too many questions, especially when it came to her mother, but she could sense the change, the way the house itself seemed to draw tighter around them, the way the air grew colder as the day wore on. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows began to lengthen, the house once again grew heavy with the weight of its secrets. The tapping resumed, more pronounced than before, as if the walls were alive with a rhythm all their own. It was no longer just the walls, though. The sounds seemed to be coming from every direction now, from the floorboards, from the ceilings, from the very air. It was as though something, or someone, was moving through the house, testing the boundaries, pushing against the fragile fabric of reality. Janet was the first to hear the voices. At first it was just a murmur, a distant sound like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But then the voices grew clearer, closer and more distinct. It was no longer just one voice, but many. Whispers, grunts, and low mutterings, all tangled together in a chorus of the unseen. They were everywhere, in the walls, in the air, in the very heart of the house. The whispers carried a strange cadence, as though they were words meant for someone else, words that were not meant to be heard by human ears. Yet, Janet could not escape them. They grew louder, more demanding, until the air itself seemed to hum with their presence. Her heart pounded in her chest as she clutched the blankets around her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. And then, just as quickly as they had started, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, more oppressive than the noise that had come before. It felt as though the very air had turned cold, pressing down on her, suffocating her. For a moment, there was nothing, just the pulse of her own heartbeat and the faint sound of her breath. But it didn't last. The tapping returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent, and it wasn't coming from the walls anymore. The sound seemed to come from within the room itself, from the very floor beneath her. It was as though something was trying to break through the surface, to claw its way into her reality. With trembling hands, Janet reached for the lamp beside her bed, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. The light flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. She turned it on, the harsh light spilling into the room, but the tapping did not cease. In the silence that followed, Janet could hear her own breath, shallow and quick, filling the space with its urgency. The house itself seemed to be watching, waiting for her to make the next move. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from downstairs. Her heart skipped a beat. The house groaned, as if in response, and Janet, her eyes wide with fear, knew that something had changed. That this was only the beginning. The crash came from downstairs, sharp and unsettling, slicing through the tension that had hung heavy in the air. For a moment, there was only the stunned silence of the house, as though it too had been caught off guard by the sudden intrusion. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate and dragging, echoed from the hallway, travelling up the stairs with a rhythm that wasn't quite right. It was too heavy, too uneven, like the movements of something not quite human. Janet froze, her heart hammering in her chest, the blankets tangled around her legs as she stared at the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her body screamed for movement, to run, to hide, but her feet felt cemented to the floor, paralyzed by a terror she could not understand. The room was unbearably cold now, the warmth of the lamp seeming insignificant against the chill that had seeped into the very bones of the house. The footsteps continued, dragging, scraping against the floorboards, until they reached the bottom of her door. Janet's pulse quickened, and she swallowed hard, trying to make sense of what was happening. The house was old, yes, and it creaked with age. But this was different. This wasn't just the house settling. The door creaked on its hinges, as though it was being pushed ever so gently. The shadows seemed to stretch out from the corners of the room, thickening, gathering like a storm cloud that had no place to go. Janet's eyes darted to the small window beside her bed, but it was too dark to see anything beyond the glass. Still, the dragging footsteps outside her door continued, a slow, rhythmic scrape that was coming closer and closer, drawing near with every passing second. Without warning, the door swung open with a violent, sudden force, slamming against the wall with a sound that rattled the window panes. In the doorway stood nothing but darkness. The figure, if there was one, was swallowed up by the shadows that seemed to spill from every crack, as though the darkness itself had weight, had form. Janet's breath caught in her throat, her eyes straining to make out anything in the abyss that had formed in the doorframe. There was nothing, but the presence was undeniable, a weight in the room that pressed down on her chest like the thickest of fogs. The air tasted metallic, cold with the sting of something foul. It was the kind of silence that filled a room with 1,000 unspoken words, where every breath felt like an intrusion on something ancient, something hidden. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence was gone. The door swung shut on its own, with a soft, almost reluctant thud, leaving behind a room that was still, too still. Janet's fingers, still gripping the edge of her blanket, trembled violently. She could taste the bitterness of fear on her tongue, the kind that left a cold, sour aftertaste. The house, once again, was quiet. The dragging footsteps had stopped. The tapping was gone. But the air still hung heavy with something unfathomable. Downstairs, Peggy stirred in her sleep, blissfully unaware of the terror unfolding above her. The children, too, slept soundly, their innocent faces unaware of the evil that had taken root in the house. Janet, though, could not close her eyes. She could feel the darkness pressing against the walls, creeping in like a slow tide. By the time the first light of dawn seeped through the thin curtains, Janet had not slept a wink. She felt hollow, drained, as though the house had drawn every ounce of warmth and life from her. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the door, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. But there was nothing. The stillness was suffocating, and for the first time, she felt the weight of what had begun to unfold. There would be no return to normalcy. Downstairs, the family went about their morning routines. Peggy made tea, her hands moving in practiced motions as she set the table for breakfast. Janet sat in silence at the table, her eyes fixed on the mug in front of her, the faint tremor still lingering in her hands. She couldn't speak, couldn't bring herself to share the horrors she had experienced. She wasn't sure if anyone would believe her. After all, the sounds they had heard were nothing but the house settling, weren't they? But the shadows in the corners of the room told a different story. The walls felt alive now, humming with a quiet energy, an energy that seemed to wrap around them like a cloak, squeezing tighter with every passing minute. And as the day wore on, Janet could sense it, could feel it, pressing into her skin like cold fingers. Later that evening, when dusk began to slip into night, the house once again began to stir. The tapping started first, soft at first, then growing louder, like the sound of nails being driven into wood. But this time, it wasn't just the walls. The taps came from the very air itself, from the floor, from the ceiling. Janet could feel the vibrations in the soles of her feet, the thrum of something unseen. It was as though the house was alive, pulsing with its own secret rhythm. Peggy stood in the kitchen, washing dishes, her back to the rest of the house. She had heard the noise too, the tapping, the strange scraping, but she had refused to acknowledge it. She wasn't ready to admit what was happening, to give voice to the fear that had begun to settle deep in her heart. It was just the house, she told herself. Nothing more. But the fear crawled beneath her skin, coiling tight like a snake, until her hands began to tremble. "Mum, what's that noise?" Margaret asked from the living room, her voice tentative, as though she too was afraid of the answer. Peggy paused, her hands still in the soapy water. She wanted to tell her daughter that it was nothing, that it was just the house settling. But she couldn't bring herself to lie, not anymore. She turned slowly, her face pale and drawn. I don't know, darling," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I don't know." As the night pressed on, the noise grew louder, more frantic. The tapping had become a pounding now, as though something or someone was trying to break through the walls, trying to escape. It seemed to come from all around them, from the kitchen, the living room, from beneath their very feet. The house trembled under the force of it, the walls shaking, the floors groaning under the weight of an unseen pressure. And then it stopped. Suddenly. Completely. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of their own breath as the house fell back into a tense, expectant silence. But this time, there was something new, something darker. A voice, faint but clear, whispered from the shadows. "Get out." The air turned cold. The words lingered in the room like a curse, heavy and suffocating. Peggy's eyes widened in terror, and for the first time since all of this began, she felt the true weight of what had taken hold of their home. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. And it was angry. The voice, soft, almost a breath on the wind, lingered in the room like a bad memory. "Get out." It wasn't a whisper, but a command, one that echoed through the corners of the house with a chilling clarity. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. as if even time itself had taken a breath and held it in anticipation. Peggy's heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling as she stood frozen in the kitchen, the dishes abandoned in the sink. The air had turned impossibly cold, colder than the October nights that had already begun to creep through the windows. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from an open window or a draft from beneath the door. It was a deeper cold, one that seemed to seep into your bones and burrow beneath your skin. Janet, too, had heard the voice. She was standing at the foot of the stairs, her body rigid, her fingers curled into the railing, as though that simple act might offer her some protection. Her gaze was fixed on the dark hallway at the end of the corridor, the shadows there thick and unnatural, swallowing everything in their wake. For a long moment, no one moved. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move, the next sound. Then, from the living room, Margaret's voice broke the silence. "What was that?" she asked, her voice trembling with the edge of fear. Peggy turned toward her daughter, her face pale, her mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. What could she say? That they were being haunted, that the house was alive, that something, someone, was telling them to leave? Peggy took a step forward toward the living room, where the children were huddled on the couch. Billy, the youngest, was clinging to his sister Margaret, his wide eyes fixed on his mother, filled with the innocence of someone who had yet to understand the full weight of what was happening. "I don't know," Peggy finally managed to whisper, her voice thin, trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. "I don't know what it is." And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the house seemed to fall into silence once more. The noise stopped. The shadows receded slightly, as if the darkness was waiting, watching from a distance, waiting for the next move. The family stood in the stillness for a long moment, each one silently trying to come to terms with what had just occurred. The cold lingered in the air, clinging to their skin, as though it had become a part of them. It was Margaret who spoke next, her voice small, fragile, as though she too feared the answer. What if it's not just the house?" Peggy turned toward her daughter, her face ashen. "What do you mean? What if it's something else? Something that's been here for a long time?" Margaret's eyes flickered toward the hallway, the shadows now dark and oppressive, as though they were stretching outward, pressing against the edges of the walls. Peggy closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself. The air felt thick with something unspoken, as if the house had become a living thing, watching, waiting. She had always been a woman of reason, of logic, but this defied reason. This was something else, something that couldn't be explained away with the mundane logic of everyday life. "We'll figure it out," she said, though the words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. "We'll call someone. We'll call the police, or a priest, or someone who knows what's going on." But deep down, Peggy wasn't sure if anyone could help them. What could be done when the house itself seemed to reject them, when the very air had become poisoned with malice? That night, the family tried to settle as best as they could. The children huddled together in the living room, trying to convince themselves that the tapping sounds and the cold air were just tricks of the imagination. Janet lay in her bed, staring at the shadows that danced across the walls, but sleep would not come. The whispers returned, faint at first, then growing clearer, as though they were spoken from within the walls themselves. The scratching, the tapping, it was all the same, a constant, gnawing reminder that something was wrong. At some point, Janet's mind began to drift in and out of sleep, her eyelids growing heavy with exhaustion when she heard it again. The voice, "Get out!" It wasn't a whisper this time, but a growl, low and guttural, as though it came from deep within the earth itself. The words were coated in an ancient fury, the kind of anger that could never be sated, never be quenched. The sound echoed through her room, wrapping around her like a thick, suffocating fog. She bolted upright in bed, gasping for air, her heart racing. She could hear the rustling of something unseen in the room with her. A presence, just out of her line of sight. Janet's eyes darted to the doorway, but it was empty. Nothing but darkness stretching out before her. Still, she could feel it. She could feel the weight of something watching her, waiting for her to move, to speak, to break the silence. The air was thick with the presence now, almost suffocating in its intensity. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the weight lifted, leaving behind a stillness that felt more oppressive than the noise. The house was silent, but in that silence, Janet could hear the beating of her own heart, loud and frantic in her chest. She didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. The next morning, she tried to tell her mother about the voice, the growl. But Peggy, tired and worn from sleepless nights, merely nodded, as though accepting it was another in a long string of strange occurrences that could not be explained. "I'll call someone today," Peggy promised, though there was a weariness to her voice that made it clear she, too, was beginning to doubt. Was there anyone who could help them? Or was it too late? As the days wore on, the activity in the house grew more intense. The tapping never stopped. It was joined by strange, cold drafts that swept through the rooms, the scent of decay that lingered in the corners like a forgotten memory. The shadows grew thicker, deeper, as though the house itself were trying to swallow them whole. But the worst came one night, when they were all gathered together in the living room, trying to find some semblance of normalcy in the chaos. The walls suddenly began to tremble, the very foundations of the house shaking violently. The floorboards creaked and groaned beneath their feet, the furniture rattling as though it were alive. And then, in the middle of it all, a voice, not from the walls, but from within the room itself, spoke again. "Get out." But this time, it wasn't a whisper, a growl, or a command. This time, it was a scream that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of the house, shaking the air with its force. The family froze, wide-eyed, as the walls around them seemed to pulse with life. The house was no longer just haunted, it was angry, and it was demanding something from them. The scream that tore through the house was unlike anything the Hodgson family had ever heard. It reverberated, not just through the air, but deep into the very bones of the house itself. The sound was raw, primal, like a cry of anguish or fury, something ancient and unfathomable that had been waiting for just the right moment to make itself known. It rattled the walls, shook the floor beneath their feet, and sent a tremor of fear through the family that seemed to settle into the marrow of their bones. Janet clutched her mother's arm, her fingers digging into her skin, as her wide eyes scanned the room. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to lengthen, curling around the furniture, pressing in closer. The air had thickened, growing heavier with each passing second. Peggy's face had drained of all colour, her lips trembling, but she said nothing. There was no point in speaking, not when the house itself seemed to be screaming at them, telling them to leave. Billy, the youngest, hid behind his older sister Margaret, his small hands shaking as he clutched her sleeve. The noise had startled him, but it wasn't just the sound that frightened him. It was the way the air itself seemed to change, to grow colder and more oppressive. There was a malevolent weight to it now, something that was not just in the walls, but in the very heart of the house. The room fell into a stunned silence, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. The tension was thick, palpable. It pressed down on them, suffocating in its intensity. They stood there, frozen, as though the act of moving might somehow provoke the house into yet another outburst. But nothing happened. The screams had ceased as suddenly as they had begun, leaving behind only the aftermath of their fury. For a moment, there was nothing. No creaks, no groans, no tapping. Just the heavy, ominous silence that seemed to have taken over the house. I think we need to go," Peggy said, her voice shaking as she pulled her children closer to her. This is too much. But Janet's heart twisted at the thought of leaving, of abandoning the house. There was something in her, some deep, instinctive pull, that made her feel like they couldn't leave. Not yet. She didn't know why, but she felt that whatever was happening here was tied to her, as though the house itself was reaching for her, calling her to stay. "Mum, I don't think we should leave," Janet whispered, her voice so small that she barely recognized it herself. Peggy looked at her daughter, her face full of confusion and fear. "What are you talking about, Janet? We have to get out of here. This isn't normal. This isn't safe." But Janet couldn't shake the feeling. It was as though something in the very walls of the house was speaking to her, telling her to stay. She didn't understand it, couldn't explain it, but it felt undeniable. "I think we need to find out what it wants," Janet said, though the words felt strange, even to her. Peggy looked at her with wide, terrified eyes, but there was no time to argue. The house was not about to wait for them to make up their minds. They needed answers, and they needed them now. It was that night that the knocking began again. This time, the tapping was louder, sharp, insistent, as though something was trying to break through the walls, to get to them. The sounds came from all directions, from the floorboards beneath their feet, from the walls around them, and from above, as if the house itself were coming alive with a rage that could no longer be contained. The family gathered together in the living room, their eyes darting nervously to the walls, the corners of the room, where the shadows seemed to pulse and shift like living things. The house felt alive now, more than ever, as though it were breathing, waiting for something, waiting for them. In the midst of the chaos, Janet stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. "We need to go to the attic," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "We need to see what's up there. It's in the walls, I'm sure of it." Peggy stared at her daughter, bewildered and frightened. "The attic? What do you mean? What's up there? What are you talking about, Janet?" "I don't know," Janet replied, her voice trembling. "But I feel it. It's in the house. It's always been here." Margaret glanced toward the hallway, where the door to the attic stood, dark and ominous. The stairs creaked faintly, as though something was already waiting for them in the shadows. "I'll go with you," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Peggy opened her mouth to protest, but her voice faltered. She couldn't stop them. Not now. Not when the house itself was demanding answers. "Be careful," she said instead, her voice heavy with fear. Together, Janet and Margaret ascended the narrow staircase that led to the attic, the air growing colder with each step. The house seemed to groan beneath their feet, as though it were protesting their intrusion. The knocking grew louder, more urgent, a sound that rattled the windows and set their teeth on edge. The walls seemed to close in around them as they reached the attic door. Janet reached out and grasped the doorknob. Her fingers were ice cold, despite the warmth of her body. She hesitated for only a moment before pushing the door open. The attic was dark. The only light came from the flickering bulb overhead, casting strange shadows across the cluttered room. Old furniture, boxes of forgotten items, and worn furniture filled the space, casting long, twisted shapes on the floor. At first, it seemed ordinary, quiet. But then Janet's eyes were drawn to the far corner of the room, where something, or someone, was standing. It wasn't human. It was a shape, a shadow, tall and wide, with limbs that twisted and writhed unnaturally, as though the very bones of the thing were wrong. Its outline was blurry, indistinct, like something formed from darkness itself, yet its presence was undeniable. The air around it seemed to shimmer, as if the thing was not entirely part of this world. The shadows clung to it, wrapping it in an inky veil that seemed to pulsate with an otherworldly energy. Janet's breath caught in her throat as she froze, unable to move, unable to look away from the thing that stood in the corner, watching them. "Get out," the voice whispered again. But this time, the words were different, slower, deeper, more insistent. The shadow in the corner seemed to stir, a low growl emanating from it, vibrating through the walls of the attic. It was not a sound that could be made by any living creature. It was a sound of something ancient, something that had waited in the dark for far too long. Janet's heart raced. "Run!" she screamed at Margaret, but her voice was swallowed by the growl, the air thick with something dark and suffocating. Before they could turn to flee, the shadow lunged. The house groaned as if in response. The shadow lunged with an unnatural speed, as if the very darkness of the room had taken form. It stretched out toward Janet and Margaret, its shape becoming clearer the closer it got. It was not solid, not human, but something in between. Something that existed in the very fabric of the house, in the cracks between what could be seen and what was hidden. Janet's heart hammered in her chest as she spun toward her sister, her legs like lead, her body frozen with fear. Margaret too had seen the thing, the twisting, writhing mass of shadow that seemed to bend the very light around it. For a moment, there was nothing but the sensation of their breath, harsh and quick, filling the attic. And then, instinctively, they both bolted for the door. The house around them groaned and creaked, as though it were alive, as though the very walls were shifting, tightening around them. The dark presence seemed to follow them, the air heavy with the weight of something ancient, as if the thing in the corner had been waiting for years, decades, centuries, for them to come. Every step they took seemed to make the air grow thicker, colder, as though the house itself was trying to pull them back. "Run!" Janet screamed, her voice trembling as she yanked the door open. The cold air hit her face like a slap, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Not when that thing was right behind them, its growls echoing in the attic, vibrating through the walls. They descended the stairs in a blur, the knocking growing louder, now coming from every direction. The house felt as though it were alive, as though the very foundations were shaking under the weight of something terrible. It was like being trapped inside a living nightmare, one where there was no escape, no safe place to hide. They reached the bottom of the stairs, gasping for air, but the darkness behind them seemed to follow, relentless, suffocating. Janet stumbled forward, her hands shaking as she grabbed the banister for support. But the thing in the attic wasn't just following. It was pushing its way through the walls, through the very air itself, closing in on them. "Mum!" Margaret cried, her voice filled with panic. "Mum, help!" Peggy appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with terror. She had heard the growling, the pounding, the strange, unnatural noise that seemed to fill the house. She had seen the way the shadows had twisted in the corners of the room. She had felt the house shake with some invisible force. Without a word, she rushed forward, her arms wrapping around her children. "We have to get out, now!" But Janet couldn't bring herself to leave, not yet. There was something, some force in the house, something that called to her, that refused to let her go. She could feel it tugging at her, pulling her back, and for a brief moment, she thought she might actually turn around and go back toward the attic, toward the shadow that had been waiting. "Mum, we can't just leave," Janet whispered, her voice barely audible. "It wants something. It's here for a reason. I feel it." Peggy's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't hesitate. She grabbed her daughter's hand and pulled her toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. "No, Janet. Whatever it is, whatever is here, it's not worth staying for. We need to go now." But as they reached the door, a loud crash rang out from behind them, a sharp, echoing sound, like the breaking of glass. The family turned to see the front door splintering, the very walls of the house shaking violently, as though something was trying to break free. The shadow from the attic had reached them, and now it was everywhere. The knocking was deafening, now coming from beneath their feet, from above, from every corner of the room. The house itself was alive, writhing, and the presence was suffocating them, pulling them into its dark embrace. "Mom!" Billy screamed from the hallway, his small body trembling with fear. Peggy turned toward him, but before she could move, the house groaned, and a cold wind whipped through the room, knocking her off balance. The door slammed shut with a violent force, trapping them inside. "Get out," the voice whispered again. But this time, it was clearer, stronger, and then the house fell silent. For a long moment, there was no sound, no tapping, no growling, no pounding of invisible fists against the walls. The air grew still, but it was not a peaceful stillness. It was a silence so thick and heavy that it felt as though the house itself were waiting for them to make the next move. Janet's heart raced in her chest, her breathing shallow and quick. She could feel the weight of the air pressing against her, could feel the walls closing in on them. "Mom," she whispered, her voice shaking. "What's happening?" Peggy didn't answer. She was too focused on the door, her hands gripping the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The lock had jammed, the handle twisted and broken, as though the house itself had decided to keep them inside. And then the shadow reappeared. It wasn't in the corner this time, nor was it in the attic. It was in the room with them, standing in the doorway, blocking their only exit. Its shape was clearer now, more defined, as though it were a part of the house itself, woven into its very fabric. It towered over them, dark and looming, its form a shifting mass of shadows and shapes that seemed to twist and ripple like smoke. The voice came again, low and guttural, crawling out from the thing in the doorway. "Leave. Now." Peggy tried to pull the door open again, but it wouldn't move. The house groaned as though in response, and the shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, pressing in from all sides. The thing in the doorway grew larger, its limbs twisting unnaturally, reaching toward them with claws that scraped the floor with a sound, like nails on stone. With every passing second, the house seemed to close in tighter, the walls growing smaller, the air growing thinner, until it felt as though they were suffocating. "We can't stay," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling with terror. "We have to leave. Now." Peggy nodded, her face drawn tight with fear. "There's no choice. We're getting out of here no matter what." But as she turned to lead her children toward the back door, the shadow lunged. The room was filled with a terrible, deafening noise, the sound of scraping, of twisting, of something tearing through the fabric of reality itself. The floor beneath their feet cracked, the walls bent inward, and the very house seemed to scream with the force of it. The door opened, but it wasn't the door to the outside. It was a door to something else, something darker. And they stepped through. The door swung open with a heavy groan, as if it, too, were reluctant to reveal what lay beyond. For a moment, the family stood frozen, their hearts pounding in their chests, their eyes wide with confusion and dread. The door had opened to the outside, or so they had hoped. But instead, it led to a place that was no longer familiar. The space beyond the door was vast, dark, and empty. No longer did they see the familiar garden or the small yard that surrounded the house, the hedges that lined the path. The air was thick with a suffocating blackness, the kind of darkness that swallowed every shred of light. There were no stars in the sky, no moon, just endless, crushing shadow. The ground beneath their feet felt uneven, like they were standing on something soft and shifting. Peggy's heart raced. She tried to step forward, to cross the threshold. But the moment her foot touched the ground, a chill shot through her body, so cold it took her breath away. She staggered back, her hands flying to her chest as if she had been struck. "What is this?" Margaret whispered, her voice trembling as she looked around. "Where are we?" But there was no answer. It wasn't the world they knew. It wasn't even the house they had lived in. It was something else, something darker. The air was still, but not in the quiet, peaceful way they had come to expect from the night. This stillness felt wrong. There was no wind, no rustle of leaves, no distant sound of the world outside. Just an oppressive, stifling silence that pressed in from all directions. "Mum, we have to go back," Janet said, her voice barely audible. She felt the ground beneath her shift again, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement that made her stomach churn. Peggy turned, her face pale and drawn, but when she reached for the door to close it, it wasn't there. The doorway had vanished. The door frame was still there, but beyond it, nothing. The house was gone, swallowed by the dark void that had replaced it. The faintest outline of the house was all that remained, distorted by the blackness that surrounded them, now just a memory of what had once been. They were trapped. The shadow had followed them. They had hoped it was gone, that it had been left behind with the house, but the shifting darkness around them only seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The growls came again, low and guttural, like a distant thunder rumbling from deep within the earth. "It's here," Janet whispered, her voice trembling as she felt the familiar weight of the presence pressing in on them. A shadow stirred at the edges of their vision. It stretched across the space before them, twisting, writhing like smoke, until it took shape. A figure, tall and formless, made of pure darkness. It loomed in the distance, its outline flickering in and out of existence, as if it were tied to the very essence of this place. The voice came again, stronger, more commanding. "Leave." It was no longer a whisper or a growl. This time, the voice was clear, with a resonant, almost inhuman quality to it. The words seemed to shake the very air around them, vibrating through their bones. "Get out! Leave! Before it's too late." It felt like the ground itself was alive beneath them, the earth shifting with an unseen force. The darkness seemed to draw closer, wrapping itself around them, its tendrils reaching for them, hungry, desperate. Peggy turned to her children, her eyes wide with terror. "We can't stay here. We have to find a way back to the house. We have to get out of this place." The figure in the distance flickered, its shape pulsing, as if it were becoming more tangible, more real with each passing second. Its form seemed to change, growing taller, its limbs elongated and distorting, as though it were shifting from one form to another, adapting to the environment it was in. Janet's gaze shifted to the ground, her heart racing. The earth beneath their feet was no longer solid. It had become soft, yielding, as if the ground were alive, breathing, pulsing with the same dark energy that surrounded them. "Mum, we can't," Janet said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "We're already too far gone." The dark figure moved toward them then, slowly, its form dissolving and reappearing in the blink of an eye. Every movement it made seemed to bend the very air around it, warping reality itself. With each step, the space between them and the shadow seemed to shrink. As the figure drew closer, they could feel its presence, cold and suffocating. It was no longer just a shadow, but something much darker, something older, something that had always been there, waiting, hidden behind the veil of reality. "We have to run!" Margaret cried, but there was nowhere to run. The space was endless, empty, and the figure was everywhere. The house, the world they had once known, had been swallowed by the darkness, leaving them trapped in this void, a place that didn't belong to any realm of reality. The boundaries between what was real and what wasn't had long since dissolved. There was no safe place here, no way to hide. And then, just as the shadow seemed to reach out toward them, the ground shifted once again. The earth beneath their feet gave way, and they fell, down, down, into the darkness. The sensation of falling was unlike anything they had ever experienced. It was as if the very fabric of the world had unraveled beneath them, and they were plummeting through the cracks in reality itself. The air around them was thick with the oppressive weight of unseen hands pushing against them, pulling them down, further into the depths. Janet screamed, reaching out for her family, but the darkness swallowed her words, silencing them in an instant. Her body twisted and turned in the void, as though gravity itself had lost its meaning. It felt like hours, though time had no meaning in this place, until they landed, softly, gently, on something solid. But when they opened their eyes, They didn't see the world they had known. They were standing on a cold, empty plain, under a sky filled with swirling black clouds. The ground beneath them was cracked, as though it had been broken open by some unseen force. The air was still, silent, and the only sound was the faint hum of the darkness around them. They weren't in their home anymore. They were somewhere else. And the shadow was not far behind. The land beneath their feet was barren and cracked, a desolate wasteland where the ground seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, shrouded in an eerie, unnatural fog. The air itself felt thick, as though it was soaked with an ancient, unrelenting sorrow. The clouds above churned with a malevolent energy, swirling in slow, torturous patterns, as though they were alive, watching, waiting. There was no sun here, no stars, only the ever-present darkness that seemed to pulse and breathe like some great, unseen entity. Peggy grasped her children tightly, pulling them close, her heart racing as she looked around in horror. There was no familiar landmark, no sign of the house they had left behind. The place they had found themselves in was nothing like the world they had known. It was a place outside of time, outside of reality, a place where the rules of nature seemed to be twisted and warped beyond recognition. "This isn't real," Peggy whispered, though her voice trembled with doubt. "This can't be real." But as she said the words, she felt a cold chill creep up her spine. This place was real. It was too real, too oppressive, and too full of a weight that pressed down on them, suffocating them with its darkness. Janet stood close to her mother, her hand gripping Peggy's tightly. Her mind was spinning, trying to make sense of the impossible situation they found themselves in. The darkness, the shadow, the endless expanse. Everything felt wrong, distorted, as though they were trapped in some half-formed nightmare that refused to let them wake. "What is this place?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. She was clutching Billy to her side, her other hand trembling as she looked around. Her eyes were wide, filled with a fear she had never known. "Why are we here?" Janet felt the answer, though it was something she couldn't quite put into words. There was a presence in the air, an overwhelming, suffocating feeling that told her they were not alone. The shadow had followed them, but it was more than just the figure they had seen in the attic. It was something ancient, something old beyond measure, something that had always existed just beyond the veil of their reality. "It's the house," Janet said quietly, her voice trembling as she spoke. "The house. It brought us here. We were never meant to leave." Her words hung in the air for a moment, before they were swallowed by the ominous silence that surrounded them. The only sound was the faint, unsettling hum of the dark sky overhead, as though the very atmosphere of this place was charged with some unspoken force. And then they heard it again, the sound they had feared would return. The tapping, the scratching. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the air, but it grew louder, more insistent, echoing from all directions. It was coming from the ground, from the sky, from the very fabric of this strange, nightmarish realm. Janet's breath caught in her throat as the tapping became rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. It was everywhere, surrounding them, closing in. The shadows shifted, twisting, coiling, until they seemed to take shape again, forming the silhouette of the dark figure they had seen before. But this time, it was different. It was larger, more terrifying. Its shape no longer just a shadow, but something more tangible, more corporeal. It was as if the darkness itself had given birth to the creature that now loomed before them. The figure was not just a figure anymore. It was something that seemed to breathe, to live, its very presence warping the space around it. The air grew colder, the ground beneath them trembling as though it, too, was afraid. "Leave. Now." The voice came again, this time a growl, a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The voice reverberated through the very core of their being, shaking them to their core, filling their minds with an overwhelming sense of dread. You do not belong here. The creature, if it could even be called that, moved closer, its form shifting as if it were made of liquid shadows, undulating and twisting in impossible ways. It reached out with arms that were long and distorted, fingers like claws, each one stretching impossibly far, as if the darkness were trying to pull them into its grasp. You are mine now. The voice was clearer, sharper this time, resonating deep within their minds, making it impossible to look away. It wasn't just a command, it was an imposition, a force that weighed down on them, urging them to submit, to surrender to whatever dark will had created this realm. Peggy's knees buckled beneath her as the weight of the presence overwhelmed her. The air had become thick, suffocating, and every breath felt like an effort to force air into her lungs. She had never known fear like this. This was something older than time itself, something primal and unstoppable. "We can't stay here," Margaret gasped, her voice breaking with the strain. She tugged at her mother's arm, but Peggy was too stunned to move. "We have to find a way out," Janet said, her voice trembling, though her eyes were fixed on the creature. "There has to be a way." But as she spoke, the ground shifted again, this time violently. The earth beneath their feet cracked, and a sound like the breaking of bones echoed through the space. The cracks spread like veins, stretching across the dark landscape, and from them, something began to emerge. From the depths of the cracks came more shadows, more creatures, more twisted forms that slithered out of the fissures in the earth, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They were nothing like anything the family had ever seen before. Amorphous, shifting masses of darkness with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through them, searching for something. For them. "We're surrounded," Margaret whispered, her voice strained with fear. "They're everywhere!" The shadowy figure in front of them began to take form, growing more solid with every passing second. Its limbs stretched, contorted, and twisted in ways that defied nature, as if it were some kind of nightmare made flesh. Its eyes, glowing with an eerie red light, locked onto them, its gaze piercing through them, chilling them to the bone. The family stumbled backward, their feet slipping on the cracked ground. But no matter how far they tried to retreat, the darkness pressed closer. It was as if they were trapped in a cage of shadows with no way to escape. The tapping, the growling, the whispers. They were all around them now, a cacophony of sound that filled the air with an overwhelming sense of impending doom. "We have to do something," Janet said, her voice rising with desperation. She grabbed her mother's arm, pulling her toward the only thing that seemed to offer any possibility of escape. The cracks in the ground, the opening that seemed to lead to somewhere else. The dark figure moved closer, its form stretching, its claws reaching for them. The voice roared through the air. "Leave! Now!" And then, just as the darkness seemed to swallow them whole, something shifted. The ground beneath their feet cracked open one final time, and a force, a great unseen power, erupted from the depths. The darkness trembled, and for a split second, the shadows seemed to recoil, as if something had intervened, something powerful enough to disrupt the grip of the dark forces surrounding them. The family was thrust forward, tumbling through the air, through the very fabric of the realm itself. They felt as though they were being pulled through time, through dimensions, until suddenly the air lightened, the oppressive weight lifted, the darkness receded, and they were no longer in the realm of shadows. But they weren't back in their home either. The family tumbled through the air, their bodies weightless, as if they were falling through the very fabric of reality itself. The air around them shimmered, twisting, distorting, like the world was being reassembled from broken pieces. For a moment, they were in complete darkness, no sky, no ground, just a void that stretched endlessly, a place where time seemed to have no meaning. Then, with a sudden, violent jolt, the world snapped back into place. The air was warmer, the ground solid beneath their feet again. The oppressive weight that had pressed against them in that realm of shadows was gone. replaced by an almost unsettling stillness. Janet's breath hitched as she looked around, trying to make sense of where they were now. The familiar sights of the Enfield house, the small council home they had lived in for so long, were gone. They were standing in an empty street, bathed in pale moonlight. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt almost unnatural. No sounds of children playing, no cars passing, not even the hum of distant voices. It was like stepping into a memory, a place that felt almost familiar, but somehow wrong. "Where are we?" Peggy whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes scanning the deserted street. She seemed to be holding herself together by sheer will, though the terror that had taken hold of her was evident in her every movement. This isn't the house. It's not Enfield." Janet felt the same. The street was too still. The houses were arranged as they always had been, neat rows of red brick buildings, the kind that had lined their block. But there was something off about them, something in the way they stood, empty, lifeless, as though waiting for something that had already passed. She took a tentative step forward. Her foot hit the pavement, and it felt soft, almost like mud, though it wasn't. As if the world beneath her feet wasn't entirely stable. She looked down and saw that the ground was slightly undulating, rippling like a pool of water disturbed by a breeze, though the air remained still. "Mom, look," she said, pointing to the streetlight ahead. It flickered once, then cast a dull, yellowish light that seemed to make everything look distant and unreal. "This is wrong. This doesn't feel right." Margaret reached out, her hand brushing the side of the house nearest her. Her fingers lingered there, as if testing the surface, as if trying to make sure it was real. "It feels like we're inside something, like we're part of it, like we're trapped in a dream." She hesitated, looking over her shoulder as the street stretched behind them, the silence unbearable. "I don't understand. How did we get here?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. The wind picked up for a moment and Peggy instinctively pulled her children closer, but there was nothing normal about the way the breeze moved. It wasn't fresh or alive. It felt stale, as though it had been trapped for a long time. It brushed against their skin in a way that made them shiver, cold and empty. As if on cue, the tapping began again. It was faint at first, barely a whisper against the silence of the night, but there was no mistaking it. The familiar sound, the scraping, the tapping, like a hand tapping against wood, came from all around them. It wasn't the house that was making it this time, but something else, something beneath the earth, beneath the air, deep within the very fabric of this place. Janet felt her skin prickle, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. "It's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The thing, the shadow, it's still here." Peggy turned toward her, fear clouding her features. "We have to get out of here. This place isn't safe. Whatever it is, whatever followed us from the house, it's not finished with us yet." The tapping intensified, sharper now, more insistent, a rhythmic pattern that seemed to echo through the very ground beneath them. Then, from the darkness ahead, a figure emerged, slowly, deliberately. It was a shadow at first, indistinct, shifting like smoke, but as it moved closer, its form became clearer. It was the same figure they had seen before, but this time, it seemed larger, more menacing, its outline pulsing with an unnatural energy. "Leave." The voice echoed through the air, but this time, it wasn't just a command. It was a threat. Low, guttural, as if it were woven from the very fabric of the darkness that surrounded them. "We can't," Janet said, her voice shaking but resolute. "We can't leave until we understand what's happening. We need to know why it's following us, why we're here." But the shadow didn't wait for them to respond. It moved forward with unnatural speed, its arms stretching out, not like human limbs, but more like twisted tendrils, reaching toward them. The tapping followed, growing louder, as though the very ground itself was alive and writhing beneath their feet. Without thinking, Peggy grabbed her children's hands and began to run, her feet pounding the soft, uneven ground. "Come on, we have to move, now!" Her voice was desperate, her breath coming in quick, ragged gasps. But the shadow was too fast. It seemed to be everywhere at once, stretching toward them from every corner, every angle. The air was thick with its presence, oppressive and suffocating. Janet could feel it, a pull in the very core of her being, as though the darkness was calling to her, drawing her in. It felt like they were running in place, the street stretching endlessly before them, the shadow always just a step behind, always looming larger, its growl rising with every passing second. And then, in the blink of an eye, the world shifted again. This time, there was no sudden tumble, no violent jolt. Instead, the air grew colder. The ground beneath them cracked open once more, and a blinding light burst forth from the cracks, illuminating everything, with an unearthly glow. They were no longer in the quiet, empty street. They were back. But it wasn't the home they remembered. The ground beneath their feet was now barren, pocked with deep, jagged holes that seemed to stretch into eternity. The sky above them was a swirling mass of black and red, as if the very heavens were bleeding. The air smelled of smoke, of rot. The houses were gone, replaced by towering, twisted structures that seemed to reach up into the sky like the remains of some ancient, forgotten civilization. This was not their world. They were back in the realm of darkness, the place they had thought they'd escaped. The tapping was louder now, echoing from every direction, the shadows in the corners of their vision swirling in chaotic patterns. The figure was there too, standing just out of reach, its dark form pulsing with the same malevolent energy that had chased them. And this time, they understood. The darkness wasn't just following them, it was calling them. And they had no choice but to answer. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the smell of something ancient and rotting, as if this place had been forgotten by time itself. The jagged landscape stretched out before them, an endless expanse of twisted ruins and unnatural shapes. The sky above was a swirling mass of black and red, an angry storm churning in the heavens, casting an ominous, blood-tinged glow over everything. It felt as though the very earth beneath their feet had become a living thing, pulsing, breathing, groaning with an energy that wasn't natural. Janet's heart raced as she looked around, her mind struggling to make sense of what they had just stepped into. This was no longer a street in North London, no longer the house that had once been their home. They were standing in a place that defied logic, a realm that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of their understanding. The tapping was louder now, a relentless, insistent sound that echoed through the very ground beneath them. It came from all directions, reverberating through the air like a heartbeat, slow, rhythmic, and impossibly close. It was as if the land itself were alive, listening, waiting, and in the distance, the shadow still loomed, growing larger with every passing moment. Peggy grabbed Janet's arm, pulling her closer. "We need to find a way out," she whispered, her voice strained. "We can't stay here. This place, it's wrong." But Janet didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the shadowy figure ahead, her body rooted to the spot. There was something about it, something about the way it seemed to pulse and flicker with an energy that called to her, something that tugged at her very soul. "Mom," Janet said, her voice barely audible. It's calling me." Peggy's grip tightened on her daughter's arm. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. "There's nothing here but darkness, Janet. We have to leave now." But Janet could feel it deep within her, this strange, magnetic pull, as though the darkness itself had reached out and sunk its claws into her heart. She didn't understand it, didn't know why it felt so familiar, but she knew that it was real. The tapping continued, louder now, the sound almost deafening as it reverberated through the air. And then, in the distance, the figure spoke again, its voice a low growl, a rasp that seemed to scrape against the very fabric of reality. "Come closer," Janet's breath caught in her throat. The voice was so familiar now, deep, resonant, like the rumble of thunder in the distance. It was the same voice that had followed them from the house, the same voice that had echoed through the walls, through the very air of their home. The same voice that had whispered through the shadows, telling them to leave, to get out. And now it was calling her, calling them. Without thinking, Janet took a step forward, drawn toward the figure that still loomed in the distance. Her body moved of its own accord, as if some unseen force had taken hold of her, pushing her forward into the darkness. "Janet, no!" Peggy screamed, but it was too late. Her daughter was already moving toward the figure, her feet carrying her across the cracked ground as if she were walking in a dream. Margaret reached out, her voice panicked. "Mom, we can't just leave her. We have to stop her." But Peggy could only stand there, helpless, watching as Janet moved further into the darkness. The air around them seemed to ripple and shift, the ground trembling beneath their feet, as if it too was alive. The tapping was louder now, more insistent, and the shadow grew ever closer, its form solidifying with every step Janet took. "Come closer," the voice repeated, and this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command, a demand that filled the air, the very space around them. It felt as though the words were pulling at her, tugging her toward them, pulling her into the void of this strange, twisted realm. Janet could feel it, the weight of the shadow pressing down on her. It was a presence that she couldn't ignore, one that felt both alien and familiar. It was like it had always been there, waiting, watching, pulling at the edges of her mind. Her steps quickened, as if her body was no longer her own. The tapping, the voice, the shadows. They all seemed to blur together now, melding into one chaotic, overwhelming force that filled the air around her. "Janet, please, stop," Peggy cried, her voice breaking. "Come back. Don't go near it." But it was no use. Janet couldn't hear her mother's cries anymore. The only thing that mattered was the darkness ahead, the shadow that was calling to her, pulling her toward it. It was as if her very soul had become a part of this place, a part of the thing that had taken hold of them, that had been waiting for them all along. And then, just as she reached the shadow, everything stopped. The air stilled. The tapping ceased. The shadows froze in place. Janet stood there, at the edge of the darkness, her body trembling with an energy she couldn't control. She felt the weight of something pressing against her, something vast and ancient, like the very earth beneath her feet was alive, breathing, watching. The voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't just in her ears. It was inside her mind, reverberating through her thoughts like a chant, a hymn. "You are the one. You were always meant to come." Janet's heart pounded in her chest. Her mind reeled with confusion, fear, and something else, something deep and primal that made her skin crawl. It wasn't just the shadow that was speaking to her now. It was something else, something older, something beyond understanding. "We are bound to you. You are bound to us. And this world is ours." The ground beneath her feet shook, and the world seemed to warp, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The shadows began to converge, swirling around her like a storm, filling the air with their oppressive presence. The tapping grew louder again, but this time it wasn't coming from the ground. It was coming from inside her. Her body trembled as the sound began to pulse in time with her heartbeat, the rhythm of the tapping now echoing through her veins, in every cell, in every thought. "Janet!" Peggy's voice broke through the chaos, but it was distant, muffled, as if it were coming from the other side of a thick fog. "Please, come back, please." But Janet couldn't respond. The voice inside her mind was too loud, too insistent. "Come closer," it whispered again. And this time, it was more than a command. It was a promise that Janet could not refuse. And so, she stepped forward. Janet's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing through the void that seemed to stretch endlessly around her. She was no longer aware of her surroundings, no longer in control of her own body. The darkness that had been calling her, that had been following her family, had taken root inside her, a pull so deep and ancient that it could not be ignored. With every step forward, the shadows grew thicker, darker, as if the very air around her had become alive, suffocating, wrapping around her in tendrils of cold. The tapping grew more frantic now, vibrating through her skin, in her bones, as though the ground itself was alive and reaching for her. It felt like the house that had once been her home, was here, somewhere in the distance, its presence lurking just beneath the surface of this place. The voice in her mind whispered again, its words smooth and soothing, laced with a sinister undertone. You are the one. You were always meant to come. We have waited so long for you. The voice was deep, resonant, like it had always been a part of her, like she had been connected to it her entire life, even before she knew what it was. It was an ancient thing, something that had existed long before her birth, something tied to the house, to the land, to the very foundation of the earth. You were chosen, Janet, chosen to lead us, to bring us home. Her body trembled with the weight of the words. She wanted to scream, to break free of this hold, but the darkness pressed closer, suffocating her, drowning out all other thoughts. The shadows twisted around her, their forms shifting, contorting into shapes that defied logic. She could see faces in the darkness now, hollow eyes, twisted mouths, silent screams, faces that stared at her from the edges of her vision, faces that seemed to have been trapped here for eternity. But it wasn't just the house that was trapped. It was them. The thing that had been following them, the shadow that had stalked them from their home, wasn't just an entity. It was part of something far older, far more dangerous. It was a remnant, a soul, a piece of something broken that had been left behind, abandoned, and now it was calling to her. Her mind reeled with the realization. This place wasn't just a void. It wasn't an empty, forgotten realm. It was the heart of the house, the soul of the house, twisted and corrupted over centuries, a place where something had been buried, something dark, something that should never have been unearthed. And now, Janet had been chosen to finish what had been started. She looked down at her hands, feeling the cold slip over her fingertips like the touch of something dead, something hollow. Her chest tightened as the realization sank in. She wasn't just walking into this darkness. She belonged here. Her very presence was drawing it forward, calling it from the cracks in the earth, from the spaces between the worlds. Janet, please. Her mother's voice echoed. From behind her, distant and full of fear, but there was something else in it. Something desperate, something that made Janet's heart ache, even as she stepped further into the shadow. Stop! Margaret's voice, too, rang out, frantic and broken. Come back! But the voice in her mind was louder now, overpowering everything else. No one can stop this. No one but you. You have always been the one who will lead us to freedom. The ground beneath her feet cracked again, the rift widening, and the shadows seemed to crawl out of the very earth, their forms twisting and writhing as though they were waking from a long slumber. Their eyes, empty, hollow, locked onto her, and they reached for her, not with hands, but with tendrils of darkness, pulling her deeper into the void. Please, Janet, come back to us, Peggy's voice begged, but Janet's body was no longer her own. The shadow inside her grew stronger, more insistent, pulling her into its embrace. She couldn't fight it anymore. She was too far gone. She stepped forward one final time, her feet sinking into the soft, shifting ground. The darkness closed in around her, and for a moment, she thought she could hear the whispers of 1,000 voices, all calling to her, all waiting for her to unlock the door that had been closed for so long, waiting for her to bring them into the light. And then, everything went silent. The tapping stopped. The whispers faded into nothing. The shadows that had surrounded her, pulling her in, disappeared. In the distance, a door appeared. It was not a door like any they had seen before. This door was ancient, twisted, made of blackened wood, warped with age. It stood alone in the middle of the empty landscape, its edges burning with a faint, sickly glow. This was it. The door to what was hidden. The door to the heart of the house. The voice in Janet's mind faded to a whisper. Open it. Her hand reached out, moving without her will, her fingers curling around the handle. It was cold, so cold, like touching ice, but she didn't hesitate. She turned the handle, and the door creaked open. What lay beyond the door was not another realm. It was the house. It was the Enfield house. But it was not the house they had left behind. This house was different. Its walls were cracked, the floors buckled and warped, the air heavy with dust and rot. There was a smell of mildew and something else, a stench of decay that seemed to choke the very air. The walls were covered in thick, dark stains, as though they had absorbed something terrible over the years. It was alive. Janet stepped through the doorway. The shadows followed her in. "Janet! No!" Peggy screamed, but it was too late. They were all trapped now. The air grew colder, and the walls around them began to pulse with a sickening rhythm, as if the house itself were breathing. The tapping began again, but this time it wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, alive and suffocating, reverberating through the very heart of the house. And in that moment, Janet understood. The house wasn't just haunted, it was the haunting, and they were never meant to leave. The door slammed shut behind them, locking them inside. Janet stood in the middle of the broken house, her body trembling as the weight of the realization settled upon her. The walls around them seemed to pulse, as though the house itself was breathing in time with her heartbeat, responding to her presence. The tapping had stopped, but the air had thickened, the silence growing heavy with anticipation. It was as though the house had been waiting for her, waiting for this very moment when the door would open and the shadows would pour in. "Janet!" Peggy's voice trembled behind her, but it was distant, as though she were standing on the other side of an unspoken divide. "Please. What is this? What's happening?" Janet didn't answer. She couldn't. She was no longer sure where she ended and the house began. The darkness had seeped into her very bones, into her thoughts, and she felt the pull of the shadows, urging her forward, urging her to walk deeper into the heart of the house. It was like a call, a primal summons, one that was too powerful to resist. She could feel the presence of the house all around her, its soul, twisted and ancient, stretching out through the cracked walls and rotting floors. It wasn't just a building. It was something alive, something that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, hidden from the world. But it had always known she would come, that she would be the one to unlock its dark secrets. Her hand reached out, almost of its own accord, brushing against the wall beside her. The surface was cold, damp to the touch, and as her fingers grazed the stone, a shiver ran through her body. It was as though the house had awakened, recognizing her, responding to her presence in ways she couldn't comprehend. "Janet, don't!" Margaret's voice broke through her thoughts, desperate, full of fear. "Please don't go any further." But Janet didn't hear her. Her feet moved forward, as if they were guided by something else, something beyond her control. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, elongating and twisting, forming shapes that flickered and danced in the corner of her vision. They were watching her, waiting. The house was alive, and it was calling to her. Each step she took brought her deeper into the darkened interior, the air growing colder, the silence more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in around her, narrowing the space, tightening the pressure in her chest. There was no escape now. The house had claimed her, and she knew, deep in her soul, that there was no turning back. She reached the center of the room, where the floorboards creaked beneath her feet, groaning under the weight of something far older than the house itself. It was as though the house had been built on a foundation of secrets, a foundation of something that had been buried long ago, hidden beneath the earth, and now it was clawing its way back to the surface. The shadows thickened around her, swirling in the air like smoke. And then, in the darkness, a voice spoke. "You have come home." It was the same voice, deep and resonant, the voice that had followed them from the walls of the house, the voice that had whispered in the corners of their minds, in the cracks between the walls, the voice of the house, the voice of the thing that had been waiting. But this time, it was no longer just a whisper. It was a command. "We have waited for you, Janet. You are the one who will bring us back." The air grew heavier, the shadows closing in around her, and she could feel it then, the weight of something ancient, something powerful pressing against her chest. It was the house itself, or perhaps something older than the house, a thing that had been locked away, hidden in the depths of the earth, and now it was free. Free because she had unlocked the door, because she had come. She could hear her mother's voice again, muffled by the oppressive silence that surrounded them. "Janet, please, you have to fight it. We're not alone. This is wrong." But Janet couldn't respond. The darkness was too loud now, too powerful. It was pulling her, urging her forward, deeper into the heart of the house, where the truth lay buried beneath layers of time and decay. The shadows rose around her, thick and swirling, wrapping around her like a suffocating cloak. "We are one now, Janet." The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was inside her mind, inside her very soul. The house was speaking through her now, through the pulsing rhythm of her heartbeat, through the blood that flowed through her veins. She could feel it in every inch of her body, a darkness that had always been there, waiting to awaken. The floor beneath her feet trembled and the walls groaned as though the house was alive, as if it had just woken from a long, deep slumber. And then, before she could comprehend what was happening, the room around her shifted. The walls stretched and twisted, the ceiling bending inward, and the air grew thick with the scent of mildew and decay. It was as though the house itself was breathing, reshaping, changing with every breath she took. "You are mine now," the voice echoed, stronger than ever, its power growing with every passing second. "We are one, and you will bring us into the light." Janet's body shook as she felt the presence of the house, no, of the thing within it, settle into her, deep inside her mind. It was like a cold hand wrapping around her heart, a force that squeezed tighter with every beat. She could feel herself being consumed by it, pulled into the darkness that had once been trapped behind the walls. And now she was the vessel. She was the doorway. "You will open the door," the voice whispered, as though it were an intimate, forbidden secret. "The door that has been closed for so long. The door that will release us." Janet felt herself slipping away, as though she were losing herself to the darkness that surrounded her. She could feel the cold pressure on her chest, the pull of the house in every part of her. And then, suddenly, everything went silent. For a moment, the house held its breath, as though waiting for her to make the final choice, the final movement that would unlock the last secret. And then the door appeared again. It wasn't the door from before, the one that had opened into the house. This door was different. It was larger, more imposing, a solid black slab of wood that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its surface was covered in strange, intricate carvings, symbols that seemed to shift and twist before her eyes. She could feel its power, a pulse beneath the surface, as though something was stirring behind it, waiting. The voice spoke again, but this time there was no hesitation, no whisper of doubt. The voice was commanding, "Open it!" Her hand reached forward, her fingers brushing against the cold wood of the door. The moment she touched it, the door shuddered, as though it were alive, as though it were breathing. And then, the door creaked open. The world shifted again. The air grew thick with an otherworldly energy, and for a brief moment, the house seemed to tremble, as if it were about to collapse under the weight of what was about to emerge. What lay beyond the door was something far darker than she could ever have imagined. The moment the door creaked open, a cold, unnatural wind rushed out, swirling around Janet like an icy, suffocating breath. The shadows that had once been contained behind the door now seemed to spill out, flooding the room with a heavy, oppressive darkness. It wasn't just a lack of light. It was something else, something far older, far more malevolent. The very air seemed to thicken as though the fabric of reality itself was being torn apart. Janet's hand still rested on the door, though she barely felt it anymore. She was no longer in control of her own body. The presence within her, the darkness that had infiltrated her very soul, had taken over. The house wasn't just the place where she had lived. It was the thing that had been waiting for her to open the door and release what had been trapped for so long. The voice in her mind was clearer now, more insistent. "Release us, Janet. We are here. The door has been opened. You have done what we asked. Now, let us through." Her legs shook beneath her, and for a fleeting moment, a part of her, some tiny, desperate piece of her, fought against it, against the growing force that seemed to drag her forward. But the power that gripped her was too strong. The presence inside her pulsed with an ancient hunger, and she was powerless to resist. She stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the blackness. As she moved, the air grew colder still. The shadows pressed in around her like hands, reaching out from the void, brushing against her skin, whispering her name. The door behind her slammed shut, the sound reverberating in the air like a death knell. There was no turning back now. The house had changed. The walls seemed to stretch and shift, warping in unnatural ways. The ceilings rose impossibly high, disappearing into the blackness above, and the floor beneath her feet had become soft, like mud, as though the very earth was alive. The house wasn't just a structure, it was part of something far more sinister, something that extended beyond the boundaries of space and time. Janet's breath caught in her throat. The shadows ahead of her began to swirl, gathering into a shape. A figure slowly emerged from the darkness, tall and looming, its form indistinct at first, but becoming more solid with every passing second. It was the same figure she had seen before, the one that had haunted the walls of her home, the one that had followed her and her family through the realm of shadows. But now, it was larger, more real, its form coalescing into something that defied explanation. The figure was a blend of shadow and substance, its outline flickering like a candle's flame caught in the wind. Its eyes, red and glowing, locked onto her, and for the first time Janet understood. This thing, this presence, wasn't just an entity. It was the very heart of the house. It was what had been waiting. "Janet," the voice spoke again, this time with a clarity that shook her to her core. "You are the one. You were meant to open the door. We are free because of you." Her mind reeled, confusion and fear swirling inside her, but she couldn't move. The force that held her in place was too strong, and the shadows around her seemed to be pulling her in, enveloping her, drowning her in their cold embrace. The tapping, the relentless rhythm that had haunted them all, had now become a heartbeat. Her heartbeat. "You have unlocked the final door," the voice continued, its tone reverberating in the very bones of the house. "You have opened the path. Now we can return." Return to where? To what? Janet tried to speak, but her lips wouldn't move. The presence inside her, the shadows that clung to her, were too overpowering, too consuming. She could feel the darkness creeping inside her, filling her, and it was as if she had become a vessel for it, a doorway between worlds. She wasn't just in the house anymore. She was part of it. The very essence of the house had become a part of her. And now it was time to bring it all together. The figure stepped forward, and the shadows followed, swirling around her like a storm, until they were no longer just shapes, but things, creatures made of dark smoke and fear, each one more terrifying than the last. Their faces were twisted, their eyes hollow and glowing, and they moved in unison, like an army of forgotten souls that had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her. "Come with us," the voice whispered, as though beckoning her to step into the darkness. "The time has come. You belong with us, Janet. You have always belonged to us." In the distance, through the swirling darkness, she could see something else. A light, faint and distant, but unmistakable. It flickered like the glow of a candle, warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the coldness that surrounded her. It called to her, a promise of something familiar, something safe. But as she looked toward it, the shadows around her thickened, closing in like a wave, and the light seemed to fade, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. "You will never leave," the voice crooned, its tone now full of satisfaction, as though it were savoring the final moments before it claimed her completely. "The house is your home, and you, Janet, are the key to our return. You will open the door to the beyond and let us in. We will finally be free." She felt it then, the cold pressure inside her chest, a sickening, gnawing sensation that made her feel like she was being torn apart from the inside. She wanted to scream, to fight, but the shadows pressed in on her, suffocating her, stealing her breath, leaving only the voice, only the call of the house. The tapping grew louder again, no longer distant, but right beside her, inside her head, until it was all she could hear. It was like a heartbeat, her heartbeat, pounding in time with the shadows. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness thickening with each passing second. "You were born to open the door," the voice whispered, wrapping around her like a shroud. "And now, the house will take what is owed." Janet's vision blurred. The edges of the room seemed to bend and twist, the darkness swirling around her, until it was the only thing she could see. And then, all at once, the shadows rushed toward her, enveloping her in their cold embrace. For a moment, she thought she might die, be swallowed whole by the darkness. But instead, she felt herself falling, the sensation of weightlessness pulling her into an endless void. There was no ground beneath her, no sky above, just endless crushing darkness. And then, there was a sudden light, a real light, not the false flicker of distant flames, but a bright, blinding light that pierced through the dark like a beacon. It was so bright that it made her eyes burn, and for the first time since she had stepped into the house, she felt herself move again. She reached for it, drawn to it by some instinct, some ancient part of herself that still clung to the hope of escape. And then, the light enveloped her completely, swallowing her whole. And the house was silent. The light was blinding, a piercing radiance that consumed everything around Janet. For a moment, she could see nothing, just the harsh, overwhelming brightness, burning her eyes, blinding her to everything. She felt her body being pulled in every direction at once, her senses disoriented, overwhelmed by the force of the light. But then, slowly, the brightness began to fade, and as it did, the oppressive darkness that had surrounded her retreated, pulling away like a receding tide. Janet blinked, her vision adjusting to the dim light that filled the air. The weight that had pressed on her chest lifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe freely. She was no longer in the house. The world around her had shifted. Soft, natural light filtered through tall trees. The sky above was blue, and the air was fresh, warm, and alive with the rustle of leaves. She stood in a quiet forest now, the ground beneath her feet solid and familiar, the earthy scent of soil and pine filling her lungs. The oppressive, suffocating air of the house was gone, replaced by a peaceful stillness that felt too serene to be real. She glanced around, disoriented. The sound of birds chirping, the gentle rustle of leaves, the distant hum of nature. It was all too perfect, too idyllic. She almost felt as if she had dreamed the darkness, dreamed the house, dreamed everything that had happened since they had first stepped into that cursed home. But the memories, the tapping, the shadows, the house that seemed to breathe, were too vivid, too real. She couldn't have imagined it all. The house had been real, the evil presence real, and something had happened to her. But whatever it was, whatever she had become part of, it had brought her here, away from the house. Her breath caught as she looked around. She wasn't alone. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure. It was familiar, though she couldn't place how. It was a woman, standing tall, with her back to Janet, gazing into the distance. Her dark hair cascaded down her back in loose waves, and she wore a long, flowing white gown that shimmered in the soft light, as though she had stepped out of a dream. The figure turned, and Janet's heart skipped a beat. It was her mother. "Mom," Janet whispered, her voice trembling with uncertainty. The woman smiled, a sad, wistful smile, as she took a step forward. Her eyes, bright, full of a love and warmth that Janet hadn't seen in a long time, met hers. "Janet," the figure said, her voice soft but filled with so much emotion it almost choked Janet. "You made it. I knew you would." Janet felt a lump rise in her throat, her eyes filling with tears. She took a step forward, drawn to the figure that resembled her mother, but something in the back of her mind made her pause. Something felt off. "Where are we?" Janet asked, her voice quivering. "What happened to the house? What's going on?" The figure of her mother reached out, toward her, her arms wide, inviting Janet to step into her embrace. "It's over now. You've broken the cycle, Janet. The darkness won't follow you anymore." Janet hesitated, her heart pounding. The warmth of her mother's voice, the soft beauty of the scene around her, everything about it felt almost too perfect, like a lie, a piece of a dream that didn't belong. But she was too tired to question it, too desperate for a sense of peace, of closure. But as she stepped closer, she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of her vision, a flicker, a shadow, far too swift and unnatural. Her breath caught in her chest. The moment of doubt swept over her like a tide. This wasn't right. She couldn't remember why, but she knew that the peace she felt here wasn't real. The house, whatever it was, wasn't gone. The darkness was still there. It was still waiting. And in that moment she realized this was the illusion. The house hadn't let her go. Her mother's smile faltered, her face growing distant. The light in her eyes dimmed, and the shadow that had been chasing them all along, moved in from behind her. The mother figure's form began to shimmer, flicker, like a reflection in water disturbed by a ripple. The smile that had been so warm twisted, stretching unnaturally, its edges sharp and cold. Her eyes, those eyes, burned with something darker now, something that was all too familiar. "No," Janet whispered, stumbling back. "No, no, no." The figure's voice was no longer soft and loving. It was low, guttural, filled with an ancient, venomous hunger. "Janet," it hissed, "we are bound, and you are the key." The words slithered through her mind, the voice twisting around her thoughts, suffocating her. The peaceful forest began to unravel. The trees turned black, their bark warped and twisted into grotesque shapes. The sky bled into a sickly, jaundiced hue, and the ground beneath her feet cracked open, swallowing the forest whole. The beautiful, serene world she had walked into turned into a nightmare. The shadows swirled, stretching toward her, reaching for her, like tendrils, like claws. Janet screamed, stumbling backward, but there was nowhere to go. The very ground beneath her feet crumbled away, and with a sickening lurch, she felt herself falling again. Down, down into the deep, endless void, the darkness pulling at her as if it were alive. The air was cold, suffocating, the space around her warping and shifting. The tap-tap-tapping began again, the sound like nails scraping against wood, each beat like a drum that thundered in her chest. The shadows curled around her, wrapping her in their suffocating grip. The figure, the thing that had been pretending to be her mother, followed, its eyes glowing red, the air around it swirling like a storm. "You will never leave," it whispered, its voice like a broken promise. With one final, desperate scream, Janet fought against the darkness. She tried to push against the shadows, tried to tear herself free. But it was futile. The house, the thing behind the house, was too strong. Her vision blurred, the walls around her stretching like taffy, folding and shifting, until everything felt like a nightmare. She could see the broken house in the distance, its dark silhouette looming above her. The ground quivered beneath her, as if the entire reality were coming apart. And she knew, deep in her heart, that there was no escape. The darkness had her. She was never meant to leave.